Right, a bunch of people are dialing in right now. We will have Mark Giese joining us momentarily. And this particular meeting today will be focused on the security extension to the OpenChain standard. For context, if you're new, this security extension is a guidance document rather than an edit of the ISO standard. The idea here is to address the fact that the market itself is using OpenChain in the context of security. So we want to make sure that OpenChain ISO 5230 is clearly understood in that context and that it's really easy to apply the standard. While we're waiting for Mark to dive in, I'm just going to paste a link to our chat. And I'm going to switch my screen share to the subject of that link. Mark shared the document on GitHub, and I have prepared a version of the document on our Microsoft Drive so that not only the people on this call, but our wider community, including our colleagues in China, Korea, and Japan, can access the document and leave comments as we go. I don't want to preempt Mark's analysis and commentary here, but I'll just show you what's going on. So we have this section 325, which is where we're doing most of the security stuff that's happening. And it's about how we can have knowledge organization around CVEs and process management there. The goal of what we're doing, all of this stuff that we're working around, is to make sure that the companies already using OpenChain in a security context can continue to do so easily. And of course, so that new companies can do this too. You're probably aware of the US executive order, which of course addressed software bill of materials explicitly and provided a lot of information around how that can be expected to work. When it comes to what we're doing in OpenChain, we have been supportive of the US executive order, of course, because we do assist with matters pertaining to process management around software bill of materials. But just as important, in other places around the world, we've seen similar initiatives and activities regarding security and open source. So for example, we're collaborating with our friends and colleagues in China regarding how policy and standards around open source in the context of national security will be addressed in that jurisdiction. Now, Mark just joined. Hey, Mark. Just for your reference, I put in the chat a link to a version of the document where people can just add comments to it online. And I'm going to hand over screen sharing to you, of course. What's displayed on my screen share is just a copy of that document. And everybody should be able to jump in, add a comment, and so on here if they wish to. And my suggestion would be this could be useful for our friends and colleagues in jurisdictions like Asia, where in particular we have a very big time difference. Right, Mark, this is your show. I'll hand over to you. Off you go. I know you've got 30 minutes only, and I don't want to keep you waiting too long.
Sure. Okay, let me share my screen here. I usually put up a very quick introductory set of slides. That's not the deck I wanted. Let's see here. We'd like to start off every working group meeting with a feedback opportunities. So basically, anybody using the current ISO spec, and do they have any feedback for us? Okay, moving on. We have been talking a while now about how we were looking to extend the spec, And as we will pick up where we talked last time, we're talking about, adding these different areas to the specification. We're working on a spec user guide. Okay, so let
Um,
me,
just so you know, Mark, something was asking if it could turn on subtitles on the slide show.
okay. I'm not sure I know how to do, you mean with respect to
When you were
slide?
just showing your slide there a second ago, it
Okay, I'm
was
not sure how to do subtitles. Is
well,
that a
it
Zoom
was just
thing?
something. It was just something nagging you. Did you want to turn on subtitles? But it was covering most of the shared slide. Now it's all good though.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So now I'm going to put the spec. I'm not sorry, the spec, the security assurance reference guide. And can you see that clearly?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay. So what I did was, based on our last meeting, I incorporated the feedback people provided. I think that there's two areas that we need to work on. The introduction can always be improved for sure. Um, but then there's several areas that I have highlighted in yellow. I'm going to scroll down to those. Um, and if people weren't here last time, the basic idea was we took our flagship spec for license compliance. We looked at the basic format and we started with that template, and we changed it up to be security assurance focused. When we say security assurance, we're focusing on largely the CVE detection and identification within the open source that you use, and being able to respond to those issues. Um, one section in the old, well, I should say the template we inherited from the spec was this idea of like having a standard practice section. We used to have a some wording around how you should have some expertise around license compliance. Well, we're not dealing with license compliance here. We're dealing with security vulnerabilities, and particularly we're very focused at the moment on CVEs, or publicly known issues that have been reported. And in this part of the document, we typically will say you should have some basic um, foundational pieces in place. Okay, standard practice implementation. We could possibly just go down as simple as possible and just get rid of these 3 or 4 and just have this one. Your organization has knowledge of CVEs. Okay, we would expect as a minimum that that is the case. Um, Now, these other sections are actually kind of touched on future sections of the spec, right? But this is an opportunity to remind people that you should have a method already in place for each of these things. Um, but then again, there are requirements that make sure that you have a documented procedure around them and so forth. So I still think that this section is a little, it's still half baked. I'm not quite sure to what degree we want to put information in here, as opposed to letting the rest of the spec serve those areas. Okay, so for now, I'm going to leave that there um, and keep them very general purpose. And we'll see if people have any feedback about that. I'll pause for a second now if anybody has any thoughts. Okay, moving on. One thing is, and Shane, this is partially a question for you. We currently have some
Yeah.
the Linux Foundation compliance directory. Does that serve also would this serve a purpose to help with security vulnerability contacts?
It currently is not designed for that per se, but in practice, when you contact the Open Compliance Directory, we're checking Salesforce for the contacts of various member companies. So I think it's no problem for us to expand the remit into security. I mean, in other words, we'll probably have that contact in Salesforce listed, and if not, we'll have a generic contact we can reach out. Yes.
Yeah, and I think we have that ability for people to register themselves with you guys, right?
We do. We do.
Mhm. So I'm not sure if we want to keep it. I'll just leave it with the name that it's being used today. But if we feel that, there's a need to, if this becomes more active, in this particular discipline, then we can talk about changing. Linux Foundation can involve it. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to that point, I'm currently coordinating with To-Do Group, in addition to other projects like SPDX, regarding the next step of how we do the overarching open source program office compliance and so on, landing page and interaction. So it's possible the Open Compliance Directory will get tagged with a new name, which broadens scope. And that's something that we should probably just include in what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, being part of the open source program office or any contact respect to open source within the organization. Okay. Coming back to this section here. Now, we have in the specification a section about where you explicitly generate compliance artifacts. And right now, I don't think there is a equivalence. Sorry, someone
It
wants
was
to
background noise. I muted.
Okay. And so there's this exercise where we go through. Let me come back. I should start here. This is the core section where all the pieces above it come together, right? Where it says that you have a program, you're taking that bill of materials we require you to have, you're going through, you're having a process for detecting vulnerabilities, you're identifying them, and depending on the risk, you're taking action, right? And at the end, we assume that you have a document procedure, right, for performing this. What we had in the spec is an additional section where you actually had to prepare certain artifacts as the outcome of that core step, which were then delivered to your end customer, end user. Okay. I don't see an equivalent, at least not now, for that with respect to security assurance artifacts. Clearly, I think you can enter into an agreement with your customer and they might want to see and audit your program, but there's no real obligations on anybody. There's no real licenses involved here, right, that require people to take certain action or certain contracts. So I'm suggesting we delete this section. Unless people can come up with a clear thought about these are the kinds of deliverables or the outputs of a given security assurance program.
And to this point, just for everyone's mental model, I mean, the idea is that this guidance document can get into your hands and you have a, tweaked, adjusted, and chopped down version of the OpenChain spec, essentially the OpenChain process management, just with the optic of security. Personally, I think that, if we can chop out pieces and it doesn't undermine what we're trying to do, that's good.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So we're really at the point where I can go ahead and chop this out. And then we're actually, it definitely is a shorter spec. Well, I shouldn't call it a spec. I got to be careful. We're calling this a reference guide. And it has very much a similar kind of role that the spec would play for license compliance. We're keeping it as a guide because really it's still a work in progress. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut this section out. Oops. Let's see if it jumps here. And then open it up to other concerns that people have. Now, one other thing I wanted to point out is, not this one, is that when people deal with security vulnerabilities, there's two things that can happen, at least two, right? There's people get software and then they actually put it, the open source into their product, and then there's a vulnerability and they have to patch it and repair it. Sometimes people are building these massive cloud platforms and they're grabbing the latest version of something, of a particular, say, container even, and there's certain vulnerabilities in there, but they don't really have the ability to patch them, right? They have the ability to upgrade or downgrade, right, to a different version. And that's commonly what's done. So they're not really in a position to repair or patch the vulnerability that they might receive, um, but more or less, deciding whether they want to go to an upgraded version of it, which removes the vulnerabilities. So I just want to call that out. Um, a lot of times, there's an assumption that people are going to patch the vulnerability, but often it's not always the case that it can be done. And I think this step over here, you have for each known vulnerability, we're asking you to, typically it's a common practice to assign a risk factor to it. And then depending on that risk, you got to take the appropriate action. And the appropriate action may be simply, again, you don't have the ability to patch it, or you simply have that ability to keep it on your awareness list, and over time just live with it. So I just want to highlight that, to make sure that we're capable of taking on both workflows. One where you're responsible for patching and fixing the software, it's expected of you. Another one where you're building this infrastructure and you have large pieces that you're not capable of patching because you don't have the resources, or that's not your core competence. But yet you have the ability to decide whether something goes in or not.
I suppose one question that comes up almost immediately relates to whether anyone on the call has direct, I suppose, experience of clients or their own company utilizing this and needing additional assistance, because a lot of the discussion we've had about this has tended to be in Asia. So I'm not sure if people on the call here today have had the same questions put to them, given that quite a few of the US companies and European companies using OpenChain for security seem to have very advanced internal security processes. And at this juncture, they didn't ask for help per se, though they find the idea of the guide intriguing and useful. Everyone's very shy today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the question would be, there's an internal application of this, but also would you feel more comfortable, or would you sleep better at night if you knew that you asked your suppliers whether they met these guidelines? Maybe, as part of your procurement process of open source.
This may be a question where we'll get most uptake once we have the feedback from our audience in China and Korea and Japan.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, that's the gist. I think where we're at is basically, I'm going to make a statement that it's now ready as a alpha release, right? And that everybody can go and look at it and decide whether that this is something that works for them, or if it doesn't, where it's broken. I'm going to leave this in yellow for now, because I feel like this is something I want to keep very open and create awareness that this is something that needs to be worked on.
Now, this isn't something for us to address immediately, but I suppose there's the question of CVEs are regarded as broken by quite a few people. It's not our job to fix that. Do you think that there might be alternative avenues apart from CVEs that people want to put into active production to mitigate the perceived issues?
Well, possibly yes, right? I think we initially intentionally said we're just going to stick with CVEs, and it's something that's a well-documented item, right? The CVE database exists. I think what you're referring to, there might be other kinds of vulnerabilities that are not necessarily publicly available. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or alternative approaches to CVEs being utilized.
Sure. I think we'd have to hear that feedback from others.
Mhm.
I think that right now our goal is it's intentional to keep it very narrow, and then let people come back and start saying, hey, wait a second, that's not completely broad enough, right? And let other people pull us in those directions. But right now, I think the CVE is obviously the most well-known way of thinking about vulnerabilities, not always the most comprehensive for sure.
Of course.
I think when I think about open source and building trust in open source, I think most of the issues that will be identified in open source end up as CVEs. Now, obviously, people can have their own additional software they write that's proprietary or commercial, but not open. And they may have additional methods and techniques they use for identifying flaws or security flaws within their code. But because their code is not so publicly available, I suspect that, it's a lot harder for us to put a process around that. And naturally, we're trying to focus on open source specifically, but not, and also at the same time, there's this force that people like to say, well, what about the other stuff, right? What about the other code we write? I think that becomes more of a prescriptive approach because their code tends to be more, proprietary or less public. However, I think again, for now, keeping it focused on CVs is a good starting point, but not written in stone.
That makes a lot of sense. Would it be useful to briefly touch on our go-to-market plan with this? So just so people know, we will be going to market with this guide as soon as possible. And that particular action on our part will mean that we'll be advertising this extensively, trying to ensure that when people are using OpenChain for security management, that we coalesce around this guide. So it's vitally important that people do take a look and comment on this, because it will have a substantial impact on the industry. And Mark, I think we're nearly there. I mean, I don't think we're seeing any objections to what's happening. So we might be able to release, mid-August or so. What do you think?
Sure, I'm comfortable enough. I think we're building it on top of a document that I think had a lot of previous review for licensing. I think we were able to focus in and add in we were building on top of how can I say it, a comprehensive set of categories of things you'd expect a program to have, right?
Yeah.
So for example, we expect a program to have a policy. We expect them to have some kind of training, or in this case, competence and awareness, right? We want to make sure, and again, we're all about a program, and that's the highly complementary to the core spec. And what we were able to do is, just take some of the core meat of the license compliance and replace it with security assurance, is what we're referring it as. And I think that, yeah, I think that would actually, that would work. So I think I have a lot of comfort in where we're at, although I always like to get usually we get a little bit more feedback at this point in time.
Maybe that's something we should ask. So we have quite a few people on the call. There's obviously quite a few people who dropped in out of interest. Is the reason you're not commenting because you have nothing to add to the wonderful existing work? Or is there another reason that people aren't commenting? Is this not central to what's on your horizon?
Hey, Shane, this is Dennis from Synopsys.
Hey, Dennis.
Hey, sorry, I kind of missed a little bit of the beginning of this meeting and probably the previous one as well. But just to get an understanding, is the idea that the security guide here, the security assurance guide, will it be part as as an extension of the ISO 5230, or will it be a separate guide that will be released?
Right. No, that's a great question. It will be a reference guide right beside the main one. So basically, if someone is looking at OpenChain and saying, hey, this fits my security profile, basically, this is the guide then just to help your optic. It's like, well, here's where you might change that word. Here's where you might change that focus. But it's basically a guide to using this ISO standard in the context of security. So it's not going to replace the standard. It won't be an update to the ISO standard at this juncture. It will be an adjacent guidance document to help you translate OpenChain into security quickly.
Okay, thank you. Do you know if there's any plans in the future, if there's requests to make this a separate ISO standard, or maybe to merge it with the with the existing OpenChain
That's
ISO standard?
definitely a Mark Geesey question. Mark, I think that's OpenChain 3.0, right?
Yeah. So we actually have identified, and I'll put this picture up again. Can you see my slide?
Looking good.
Yes, I can see it. Yeah, thanks.
So just a little history for those that were not here in the last few meetings. OpenChain exists, right? And we realized that the core of the OpenChain spec was the bill of materials, right? This is an important list of open source within anybody's software solution. And then we realized there's a number of activities that can happen in addition to license compliance. Although license compliance is where everybody typically starts, right? You can't ship your product legally unless you're complying. And then we decided to look at having additional optional pieces, not necessarily required to achieve the initial spec, right? So we don't want the security part to necessarily, at least initially, be a requirement. In addition to license compliance, you must do security assurance, but to have it as an optional piece, okay? And so where the spec is going is it's looking at these other areas as well. Potentially export compliance might be another one. We also like to highlight that in the 3.0 spec, we're looking at taking community engagement part of the spec that currently exists and pulling it out as another optional piece, because it's it's complementary to the license compliance, but it's kind of also slightly separate, right? That's where you ask them to have a policy around engaging with the community and so forth. We thought that actually community engagement would be a really natural first optional piece, because you could pull it out, make it optional, and broaden it out a little bit, make it a little bit more beefier without putting a burden on people around license compliance, so they won't get deterred by saying, oh, there's more requirements around getting to the spec. But then use that as a first kind of optional to the spec, and then security is a natural also next optional possibility. So those are the next two that we see when the new spec comes out, that they'll probably sit alongside the current version of the spec. Not necessarily expecting the current spec to change a lot. In fact, people don't want it to change a lot, right? Unless we see something really problematic with the spec, then we'll definitely look at bringing the community together and fixing it. But then we see more of these optional pieces, and they're not required pieces.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for the background. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and just so you know, for wording wise, we purposely called it a reference guide, because we don't want to create that sense that it's really spec material yet. But yes, that intentional is to make it a spec, which is an optional piece in the future.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
And I'll just remind people that the way we consistently think about this is we're here. The ultimate, goal is to build trust in the use of open source. And we believe all these items here are natural to that mission, right? Building confidence between organizations around license compliance, community engagement, security, export, and functional safety. That's all I have to offer today. Maybe what we'll do is we'll let people take the current draft, read it with having more time, and then next meeting we'll open up to additional feedback. Or they don't need to hesitate. they can actually start providing feedback on the mailing list as well.
Excellent. I just see Sammy unmuted. You may have something in now. Mark, I know you have to go right now for another meeting, but I'm stay online. And Sammy, if you've got a question, happy to take it.
Yeah, it's not a question. It's just more of a comment. I think you know that I generally tend to comment, but I do feel that with security, different individuals in most organizations are not the same individuals who do the license compliance. So I do want to share this with some of my internal security focused folks, and then hopefully provide some feedback.
Yeah, and I think the one suggestion for that kind of discussion is to ask them, one, obviously, how do they feel about meeting these requirements? I don't think they're that high of a bar. But secondly, would these be the types of requirements they would expect your supplier, right, from a security perspective? You know, clearly you understand those two, but I think it's important for us to have those two different discussions with with the security team to make sure that we're going down the right path, and also remind them we're starting out with a very narrow view of what, you know, and then, you know,
no, absolutely, Mark. I mean, as I said, it is just that they might have other things that they might expect to see in the spec. That's why I'm keen to involve them and hopefully try and convince them to attend the next meeting.
Sure. Okay, great. I have to go, but
All right.
I look forward to the feedback.
Thank you so much. And SC, I noticed you've got your hand up. Happy to take your comment or question. Mark,
Yeah.
later.
Yep.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, no problem.
Yep. As you may know, there is another project in the Linux Foundation, which name is Open Source Security Foundation, OpenSSF.
Yes.
Their goal is collaborating to secure the open source ecosystem. So I'm just curious that, do we have any collaboration with them regarding the security extension?
Yes, we do. In that, essentially, I'm coordinating all of this activity through David Wheeler, who's dealing with OpenSSF and also the security application of SBOMs and OpenChain. So we're all tying it together. OpenSSF is not directly working on editing this spec. We're providing this guidance document for the community to edit first, and then we'll be bringing OpenSSF in as we are reaching release to tie in. But yeah, all of our projects are interacting, and we are discussing how to make our interaction closer and closer.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. So for those who aren't familiar, Linux Foundation has an extensive run of projects covering essentially governance right now. And OpenSSF is one, which is basically working on processes and education around security. OpenChain is, of course, overarching process management, which assists with whatever you're up to with open source. SPDX is software bill of materials. And then there's various tooling projects and so on and so forth. What's happening with OpenChain is that in a de facto sense, our ISO standard is being applied to security. It's already there. So we're trying to make this official deliverable as quickly as possible so that we have something really solid for the other projects to work against and reference. To give you an idea of the schedule, our next meeting for global work teams is on the 10th of August. And I expect that meeting in 2 weeks to be the wrap up. That'll be the final chance for people to make any comments on this document. And I'll look to release it on the 11th of August, at which point it will be going public on all of our channels. So you have 2 weeks if you want to make any comments on this document. What we have currently is based on a consultation process that has taken approximately 8 months across 2 mini summits and multiple work group meetings. Where Mark has been editing this, we've had some private feedback, we've had some feedback on lists, and we've had some feedback on calls. We've taken our time. We're confident this is right. And we're also confident that it needs to go to market as soon as possible because everyone is already using OpenChain in multiple contexts. And we just want to align everyone on it. If you want to have a particular insight into the types of companies that are really looking at this extensively, companies in infrastructure, edge computing, defense, automotive, and aviation are particularly interested in this, along with cloud companies. Okay, so that's the demographics that are pushing hard. Some of those are pushing hard because of what's happening in the US, some are pushing hard because of what's happening in China, and some are on completely different tracks, like the cybersecurity track that's been underway with the Japanese government for 2 years. But everyone's coalescing. Alrighty, final comments or questions? If not, we're going to wrap up this call. Tomorrow, this document will go to everyone. Oh, hey, Sebastian, off you go.
Hello. Yeah, it was very interesting to see Mark's presentation there, and I'm just offering to respond to any questions about SPDX because there's obviously 2 weeks is a short deadline, and if you have any questions, I think I can do my best to answer them from the SPDX perspective.
I've got a question. Do you have a final publication date from ISO? Because I know SPDX is queued for August for publication.
Yeah, I haven't heard any updates about that, but if you want me to ask, there's the tech team meeting tomorrow, so I can bring you an email back from that if you want.
That would be super. Obviously, SPDX is widely used in OpenChain projects ecosystem, so we're all waiting anxiously for the official publication.
Great. Well, I'll send you that email.
And for everyone's context, in the background, we've been noodling on how open source tools can become turnkey and interoperable. I will have a call with one of the board member companies this week, second call, which may put in motion something very useful in that context. And basically, we hope to align closely with SPDX in August with essentially our work on tooling in interoperability to be focused on SPDX, ingest and export. And you know, if we can time it to the ISO standard release or just after, that would be perfect.
Yeah, and just to let you know, the SPDX outreach team is working on some plug fests, SPDX specific plug fests. And the idea is to create a plug fest in a box for manufacturers of SPDX compatible tooling to test their mutual compatibility.
That would be very useful indeed. I'm sure that some of our ecosystem vendors may also be interested. We have companies like Synopsys, FOSS-ID, WhiteSource, and so on as part of our ecosystem with proprietary tooling, as well as open source tooling. So yeah, okay.
Very exciting. Everything's happening in August.
Yeah, when everyone's on vacation. There you go. When you come back from vacation, everything will be fixed. So yeah, final note then. Thank you very much, everyone. And like I said, we have 2 weeks on this. Meanwhile, you can expect the document to circulate via the mailing lists and across the internet tomorrow. Thank you all. Have a lovely day, and I look forward to talking with you very soon.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.